Hey guys, what is up? Pelly here back with another video, and today we want to talk about the state of Voidweaver. So there's been quite a lot of discourse since this spec has been added, and really in this video I want to go over kind of what's good about Voidweaver currently in its state, what could be improved, and are any like game-breaking bugs that are kind of on the ugly side of Voidweaver. So let's dive in. Alright, so Voidweaver is one of the two hero talents that we have access to as a Shadow Priest in the War Within. Voidweaver is shared between Shadow and Disc Priest. So Voidweaver is definitely one of the most thematic hero talent trees that we've seen added into the game across all classes and specs in the game. Quite thematic, I think, for Shadow, and looks visually pretty cool as well. And this guy is kind of centering around a new spell called Entropic Rift. Now, the Rift itself is summoned by the start of the Void Torrent cast, and then it actually gets refreshed at the end of the Void Torrent cast, and then after a few seconds of various extensions and whatnot, it then collapses into Collapsing Void. So it's a very cool mechanic visually that gets added to the spec, and there's quite a lot of kind of theme elements added here as well. Okay, so starting off with the good stuff, I think ultimately one of the best positives about Voidweaver is that it's just visually exciting to see. Now, the animations, are kind of polarizing to some people, but personally, I think they just look really awesome. The new Void Torrent, I think, paired with the new Rift, all looks pretty cool. Although, obviously, everyone's going to have their preferences, so some people might prefer the old Void Torrent, for example. But I think the Rift itself, when it spawns and as it collapses, I just think it's really cool to look at visually. There's a couple things they could clean up with, like how it spawns in, but I think it's just such a great baseline. I think the other big positive with Voidweaver, in addition to that, is just kind of the damage type that this enables for us, particularly inside of Mythic Plus. So Entropic Rift is spawned by Void Torrent, which Void Torrent by itself has a 45-second cooldown baseline, and then we can talent in a Malediction to make Void Torrent a 30-second cooldown baseline. So while both of these talents are most definitely going to be required for this spec, this is kind of enabling a 30-second burst playstyle that we haven't had access to before. So every 30 seconds, you have pretty significant damage output. Now, there is a bit of awkwardness there with like Shadow Crash is 20 seconds and our Torrent is on 30-second windows. So it's going to be a little struggle on like lower keys depending on how often you're pulling packs. But I think at like the medium to high key level, I think this is going to feel really fun, and you're going to get a lot of like windows to do good damage, which I think is good. And the other thing, which, if we're talking about the positives here, is the thing I can't forget to mention is our kind of utility choice nodes in this tree. So you have two choices in this tree. The first one is No Escape versus Dark Energy. No Escape simply says enemies are slowed by up to 70% the closer they are to the Rift. I don't know how often this will be used, but I think when it's used, it's going to be super powerful. And the other one is Dark Energy, which simply says Void Torrent can be used while moving, and while the Entropic Void is active, you move 20% faster. So I think this is just a really fun thing to play with, and it feels really fun as well. And our other utility choice is Void Leech and Embrace the Shadow. Void Leech is just siphoning health from our allies, which is super fun and thematic on the kind of more vampire theme, though. And then Embrace the Shadow is kind of like a magic DR for those specific applications as well. Embrace the Shadow is a little bit more niche, but yeah, I think these utility points are just really fun and really cool. I was kind of hoping for the Rift pulls enemies in at the end of it or something like that, but I think ultimately that just would be way too strong and be weird to attach that kind of CC to an AoE damage spell. So it is what it is. So yeah, those are the main positives when I look at Voidweaver. All right, now I want to spend some time talking about what could be improved in regards to Voidweaver. This list is quite a bit longer than the one for Archon, but I think part of that's coming from a place of this hero talent spec in particular has so much potential that I think a lot of the community is invested in it being as fun as it possibly can be. So this is really just kind of taking this with, we want to make this as good as it possibly can be. And so we're kind of nitpicking a little bit here and there, but I think these are really important points to bring up. So the first one on the list is with Shadowy Insight. So if you've had a chance to play this at all, one of the first things that comes in with the kind of awkwardness of the spec is kind of how important Void Blast is to your kind of Rift windows. So when you open the Rift, you get access to Void Blast, which hits really hard, deals a lot of insanity. It's a great spell, and one that we're trying to min-max. At current levels of haste, especially if you're playing Darkening Horizon, you could pretty much safely get like 2 to 4, kind of depending on how many extensions that you're getting, cast out of Void Blast. Now this is highly dependent on how much haste you're running. Do you have Power Infusion active? Do you have Bloodlust active? Because just like Mind Blast, The cooldown of Void Blast is reduced by haste, so we can kind of get out more cast that way. The part that kind of is mostly frustrating here is with Shadowy Insight. So Shadowy Insight procs can not only make or break just how much damage you're doing, which by itself is okay. The kind of inherent problem that feels really bad with this is we are incentivized to actually pool up charges of Mind Blast before we cast our Void Torrent to make sure that we can get as many off in that window as we possibly can. Now, that's going to be a little awkward or unintuitive for some people. You know, like 5 to 6 seconds before Void Torrent, you like shouldn't be pressing Mind Blast, right? Even if you're capped on charges. So that gets a little awkward in and of itself. And then when you layer Shadowy Insight on top of that, if you happen to get a Shadowy Insight proc, either while you're banking up those 2 charges or in the middle of your Void Torrent cast, that can be super awkward because you're just missing out on a free cast of Void Blast there. The Shadowy Insight does not grant a temporary charge like it used to. It just makes your next cast be instant and then resets whatever that remaining cooldown is. So if you're capped on charges, that reset doesn't do anything. You just get the extra damage or whatever it is. Or not the extra damage, the extra instant cast bit. So I think this just kind of feels bad to play with right now, but it can be really strong at the same time, so you're definitely going to play with it. So I think that's one of the first things to bring up is just that interaction. The easiest fix here is just to make Shadowy Insight grant a temporary charge of Mind Blast again, meaning if you have a proc, you could get up to 3 charges of Mind Blast. I think that would make this just feel much better. If this is going to exist in the game, I think having that mechanic feels crucial. Because realistically, you can't make Void Torrent reset the cooldown of Mind Blast. I think that'd be way too strong and encroach on Void Eruption's strength too much. So I don't think that'll work. And for those of you wondering, like, oh, well, can't you just cancel your Void Torrent early? We don't want to do that because while casting Void Torrent tears the rift open, at the end of the Void Torrent channel, it will refresh the rift's duration. So we always want a full channel Void Torrent. So yeah, that's kind of the biggest point, or one of the bigger points that I'd like to see improved on. The other one is the travel time of the rift itself. So you're probably seeing some footage in the background. When you actually cast Void Torrent, it's going to take the rift a couple seconds to actually reach the center of your target's hitbox. This seems pretty fixed to be 3 seconds. So from the time the rift spawns until it actually lands at the center of your target, assuming the target's not moving, that will take 3 seconds. The time until the first actual tick of the rift is going to use, depending on haste, it's going to be about a second and a half, give or take, before the rift hits the target's hitbox. This does depend on how big that target's hitbox is, but on average, it's about a second and a half that we have to wait there. This is particularly frustrating because I'm not sure from like a tuning perspective how exactly they make this feel fair, because the rift is ticking while it's out. So depending on like positioning and that kind of thing, you might be losing out on a tick of this. And in fact, almost always, if you're a stationary target, that kind of thing, and you can't cheese the targeting, you will always miss out on 1 tick of the rift just because of that mechanic and how it works. I'm assuming they did that for like thematic reasons to like see it launch itself in, but personally, I'd really like them to change this to actually spawn directly under your target and have a bit more velocity when it's moving. Another point to bring up is that right now the rift actually moves pretty slowly relative to how fast a target can move. You see this particularly on the council encounter in the new raid, where the boss is literally flying all the way across the room, and the rift is just kind of dragging itself along if that's the target that it's fixed onto. So I think some improvement there, and not only how it winds up, but also how it follows targets could go a long way to making this feel better. All right, some other points to bring up. The next one is about Mind Spike and Mind Melt. So like I mentioned before, the kind of tuning of Voidweaver is really important, and they've kind of been adjusting this recently. Depending on how strong Void Blast is, we are super incentivized to really play around Mind Spike, and specifically the interaction with Mind Melt, which causes Mind Spike to increase the critical strike chance of your next Mind Blast or Void Blast by 20%, stacking it to 4 times. This gets into a bit of like weird gameplay loops where you're hyper incentivized to cast a bunch of Mind Spikes before you go into your Void Torrent window, and then you want to weave in Mind Spikes in between to make those Void Blasts powerful. This is just a little awkward in terms of like talent choice and kind of forcing us into more options here. And it feels a bit more like, because of the balancing of Voidweaver, this can kind of really swing it into Mind Spike's favor a bit too much, in my opinion. So I'm not quite sure what the best answer is to solve this, but I do think that this kind of choose your own playstyle of Shadow Priest is getting a little awkward with some of these like filler choices lining up weirdly with some of these other things. We're kind of seeing some of that here. So, and it is kind of, again, incentivizing more Dark Ascension gameplay as well. Which, another thing to bring up with the Voidweaver tree is just the kind of lack of more interactions with void themed spells. So this is more of a nitpick than anything, but there is a lot on the tree that isn't exactly what I would have expected from a Voidweaver tree. So we have a couple nodes like Devour Matter, Void Wraith, Depths of Shadows, right, Inner Quietus. These nodes are all working with spells like Shadow Death and Mindbender, or just our dots by itself. And just kind of makes Voidweaver feel less focused on the void theme of itself. Particularly like Shadow Death, that's clearly a shadow spell. Mindbender clearly, doesn't have anything to do with void itself, although you can upgrade to the Void Wraith, which I guess that counts. But it was kind of sad to not see anything on the tree specifically for void form. Archon has more interactions with Void Form than Voidweaver does, and that just feels like a miss to me, that there should be something on here that is kind of like leaning more in towards the Void part of our kit. So I was sad to see not as much interactions with that stuff, and it feels like the Shadow Death, Inescapable Torment, and like pet style gameplay is just a little weird. And again, back to the choice thing, we are already locking into Void Torrent, Malediction. I already brought up the Mind Spike, Mind Melt thing. Shadowy Insight gets really strong. And then you also are incentivized with all the Mindbender, Inescapable Torment, Yashiraj stuff. There's just quite a lot, and it's kind of reducing how much flexibility we actually end up getting in our talent tree, particularly for Idol of Yogg-Saron, where there really isn't anything on here that has anything to do with apparitions, Void Eruption, Void Form, that kind of thing, which is just more feels bad than anything. Next up, the other kind of things to mention is that I think there's a couple oddness or quirks with the spec. One of them being when you cast the Rift on a target from Void Torrent and that target dies, the retargeting of the Rift was added recently, but it does seem a bit too random at the moment. I don't think it's like going off of like the nearest target, for example. So you might see, especially dungeons where there's like enemies that are in combat with each other but not necessarily with you, it can actually just fly all the way towards them instead of retargeting something else in the pack that you're already fighting. So I think any kind of improvement there will be greatly appreciated. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up related to the kind of off theme of the tree, but it's just Devour Matter in general. I do think Devour Matter as a node itself can be super powerful when you're consuming an absorb. If you're not sure exactly how it works, basically if a target has an absorb on it and you cast Shadow Death, it can deal up to 300% extra damage based on how much is left in the absorb that the enemy has, and grant you 5 insanity. This by itself is really strong anytime that an encounter or a fight does have an absorb, but for the 90% of cases where it doesn't have that, it is kind of weird or feels bad that there's a node on the tree that's just doing nothing. So I wonder if there is anything to make this feel a little better. Obviously, it can be tuned around this, no problem, but I think, just to make the node feel better to have on the Voidweaver tree, if there was some kind of opposite effect where, okay, Shadow Death does this thing when the target has a shield, but maybe if the target does not have a shield, it also does this instead. Or not also, but instead does that. So I think they could play with that idea a little bit. It'd be kind of interesting. But again, just kind of bringing it up, it is, again, weird that the tree is more Shadow Death focused when it's not clearly speaking a void spell. So I know quite a lot of stuff. Those were all the kind of big comments and feedback we'd like to see improvement on the Voidweaver side. Let's wrap the video with the current bugs or the ugly side of Voidweaver. All right, so from a bug perspective, and again, we reported all of these in game as well, but I wanted to bring this up because until they're fixed, it is going to kind of hurt the ability of Voidweaver to feel fully completed. The first one to talk about is just with the Rift in Void Blast itself. We're not exactly sure what's triggering this, but in certain conditions, something is clearly happening and it's breaking your access to Void Blast. The Rift will still be out and ticking, but then Void Blast just goes away and you're just stuck with your normal Mind Blast. This bug is super frustrating. It's happening quite a lot in raid testing. Could be slightly related to, the mob running away or having like a dash or a blink or something. The weird part is the Rift is still active, so something is clearly bugged there, so hoping to see some fixes there. Next up is with Void Wraith. So Void Wraith is actually quite strong, particularly in single target, or especially in if you really care about reverse execute the high health bits of Void Wraith. Unfortunately, though, Void Wraith does not have the existing kind of pet reduction of incoming damage. So if you're not aware, pets like Mindbender, Shadow Fiend, Yogg-Saron, that kind of thing, they have a modifier to make sure that they take much less damage from environmental or like boss encounter mechanics so that they don't die. Void Wraith currently does not have that being applied, and we were doing raid testing just a couple days ago, and Void Wraith is taking like 10 times more damage from mechanics than Mindbender is, and it's just getting killed all of the time in Raid and Mythic Plus. So until this gets fixed, Void Wraith is basically unplayable, which is really unfortunate. So it's making testing a little challenging, especially in like those controlled raid environments that we don't always have access to. So really hoping they can kind of apply that fix to make Void Wraith not so made of paper, which would be really, really great. And the last kind of game-breaking bug that's Voidweaver specific that I wanted to bring up is with Darkening Horizon. This one is just kind of weird to test, but it doesn't feel like Darkening Horizon is working consistently. Sometimes when you cast Void Blast, you'll get the 1 second extension. Sometimes you get a 2 second extension, and sometimes you just don't get any extension at all, even if it's your first Void Blast of that rift. So I think there's a bit of awkwardness with how it's applying the cap and that kind of thing. Something is clearly bugged out here, and I'm not quite sure what it is. All of the buffs and how Darkening Horizon is all scripted on the back end. There's no buffs showing you how it's working, so it's hard to tell exactly what's going on, but we know for sure that it's not quite behaving as it's supposed to. So those are the 3 main game-breaking bugs specifically for Voidweaver. If you're interested in all the bugs that we currently know about for Shadow Priest, there'll be a link in the description below that we kind of keep for tracking purposes. And all of the feedback that we mentioned in this video is also posted on the forums. If you like what I've been saying, feel free to like it. If you have access to the forums, please post your own feedback. If you agree or disagree, I think having more voices to make the spec better is always a good thing. But that is it we have for this video. Hopefully this was enjoyable, and I'm not sure how often I'll do these kind of updates as things change. Things are changing kind of weekly, but this is our current State of Voidweaver update for beta. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for all the members that are supporting me, and we'll see you in the next video.